The first weekend of the 2023 Rugby World Cup is over, and we've learnt a lot of things, I think, this weekend. It's been very, very interesting. Now, I'm assuming that a lot of you watched all the games, so you know who won. And in this video, I'm going to take a deep dive into two main areas that I think are going to remain critically important throughout this year's Rugby World Cup, and see what teams did well in those areas and see what other teams are struggling. So stay with me and check out this video. Hello and welcome to Inside Rugby. My name is Mark. I'm a Kiwi rugby fan who's living in beautiful Cancun in Mexico, and I'm following all the games throughout this year's Rugby World Cup and beyond right here on my channel, so stick around with me. Now, I thought it might be really interesting to make a video about the first weekend's play at this year's Rugby World Cup, find out a little bit more about what happened behind the scenes in depth, and also look at what teams are performing well and what teams have got a bit of a worry and concern about them, and I'm going to cover all that in this video. So first of all, let's have a look at the pool groups and see what's happening as far as who's leading each pool at the moment. So checking out Pool A, and we have Italy leading Pool A with a bonus point, and France is in second place. In Pool B, we have Ireland and South Africa, Ireland having a bonus point in that particular group. In Pool C, we have Wales and Australia, both with bonus points, but we also have Fiji, who scored 2 points for that great comeback against Wales in their game. And then in Pool D, we have Japan leading the group with their bonus point, and England in second place. So that's how the pool situation is looking after the first weekend of this year's Rugby World Cup. I made some videos talking about what I thought would be the most important components for each team in this year's Rugby World Cup, and I focused particularly on discipline and the impact that teams would have off the bench during the tournament. So what I've done is I've done a little bit of a deeper analysis into how that worked out over the first weekend of the competition, and it's come up with some very interesting reading. So I wanted to share that analysis with you in this video. And if we start off with discipline, we'll see who were the best teams when it came to keeping their emotions under control and keeping their players on the field. And as we know, that's going to be a very, very important part of Rugby World Cup 2023. So what I've done is I've put a ranking list together of all the teams that played over the weekend and looked at their discipline from a point of view of how many penalties they conceded and how many yellow and red cards they may have had. So let's go down the list quickly and have a look at those teams that were the best disciplined teams over the weekend and those that were the worst. So starting off, the number one team as far as discipline goes this weekend was France. They just conceded 4 penalties in that match against New Zealand. They had no yellow cards and they had no red cards. Now, I thought this was an outstanding performance by France, given the fact of the moment, the pressure that was on them from their home team, how pumped up their players would have been to prove themselves in front of that fantastic crowd at the Stade de France, and for them to maintain their poise against the All Blacks of all teams, to concede only 4 penalties in that game and have no cards. I think that was an exceptionally good performance by the French team. So they were number one ranked when it came to discipline for this weekend's game. In second place, it was Ireland. They conceded just 1 more penalty, and that was 5 in total against that Romanian team. And of course, when they're scoring so many points as Ireland did against Romania, I guess they were pretty much spending most of their time running the rugby ball and scoring tries, of which they scored 12 in that. You can see the rest of the list there. Japan coming in with 1 yellow card, and we'll move on down towards the bottom of the list, and you can see the teams that had some issues with discipline in this first weekend. So Chile played Japan, and as you can see, they had a little bit of a trouble. They got 2 yellow cards as they were trying to chase that game against Japan, and Japan were putting a lot of pressure on Chile in that match. So no doubt about it, Chile's going to learn a lot from this first World Cup experience they're having, and I really like the way they attacked this game. Chile, I thought they looked very good at different stages of that particular game, but discipline is something they're going to have to work on. Now if we look at teams that had more than 10 penalties in the game, we start off at the level of Scotland, and of course the pressure they were being put under by South Africa was obvious in that game. Now for a lot of people writing in on my comments was suggesting that it wasn't a very exciting game and that the Springboks didn't play very well. Well, I thought the Springboks controlled that game pretty well with their tight play and also their amazing defense, and obviously that was getting to Scotland and unsettling them when it came to the penalties that were conceded by Scotland. So 10 penalties in that game by Scotland, and I'm sure Gregor Townsend and his crew are going to be looking at that to see how they can improve their discipline against these top teams. And then moving down the list, maybe some surprises there, but not probably with Romania. 12 penalties conceded and 1 yellow card against Ireland. They were absolutely bashed around the field in this game, Romania, under a lot of pressure all the time. So probably no surprise with the number of penalties they were giving away, as well as accepting the yellow card in that particular game. But I think the next one's very interesting and also very telling. New Zealand. They conceded 12 penalties in that game against France, and they also had a yellow card. So comparing that to the French discipline in that game where they only conceded 4 penalties, I think the All Blacks really slipped up in this game, and I think it was critical from a number of points of view. First of all, a lot of those penalties were within kicking range, and Thomas Ramos was able to get those penalty kicks for France, so he kept the scoreboard ticking over. So I thought this was a big problem for the All Blacks, and another reason for the All Blacks, not just for the point of view of ticking the scoreboard over for France, but also giving France the opportunity to get field possession. And while the All Blacks were trying to play this game in French territory, every time they put some pressure on and they made a silly mistake, gave away a penalty, it gave France the opportunity to clear the ball out from inside their own territory, and that's what happened in this game. So I think discipline is really, really critical in this year's Rugby World Cup. Yes, we can talk about yellow cards and red cards and how critical they are, but I also think discipline through general play time is also going to be really important, as we saw in that All Black game versus France. And if you go and watch the game again, you'll probably see it in a different light, because I think the All Blacks were in that game for large parts of it until they gave away a lot of penalties, and it gave France the ascendancy at those different and critical times to score the points that they did. Okay, so another couple of teams in the bottom of the rankings when it comes to discipline this weekend that you may have thought wouldn't be in the bottom is Argentina and Wales. Wales being the worst disciplined team of the Rugby World Cup in the first weekend, conceding 17 penalties to Fiji in that game. And as I spoke in my previous video, and a lot of people have made comments about my comments in that video regarding that passage of play where Wales were choked up against their line, and referee Matthew Carley gave a lot of penalties against Wales without giving a yellow card. And you've all made your points about why a yellow card wasn't given, but Wales did concede a lot of penalties. So 17 penalties in that game against Wales in the weekend. Sorry, for Wales in the weekend against Fiji, and they come out top of the most ill-disciplined team in the Rugby World Cup for weekend number 1. Of course, Argentina conceding 13 penalties, and with George Ford on fire with his boot in the weekend, it obviously gave England a lot of opportunity to score those points that they did, and also while they were down to 14 men. So we can see once again how critical discipline is in these games. And England won that game because of their great game strategy with 14 men on the field. They put pressure on Argentina in their own territory, and as a result of that, they got disciplinary issues against Argentina that led to those penalties that George Ford actually got over. So there we go, discipline, a huge, huge component of this year's Rugby World Cup in weekend number 1. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to take a deep dive into after the first weekend of competition is that of what impact did the benches have. Now, I spoke in videos before the World Cup started about how important I thought the benches were going to be in this year's Rugby World Cup. Now, what I've done here is I've put together some fairly basic analysis looking at how the teams played in the first half in regards to the number of points they scored, and then looking at how many points they scored in the second half. Normally this would indicate the impact of the bench. Of course there's other factors that we need to take into consideration, and that could be around discipline with players from the opposing team getting cards and being sent off, and also what the coaching strategy team comes up with at half time to maybe change the nature of the game. But an interesting component that came out of the first weekend's play was that all the teams, every single one of them that led their game at half time, they went on to win their match in the first weekend of this Rugby World Cup. So let's look at the first game played this weekend, and it was between France and New Zealand, and France led that game 9 points to 8 at half time. Now the second half score was 18-5 to France to give them the score of 27-13 at the end. So France did better in the second half, so it could indicate that the All Blacks bench did not have an impact, and it didn't change the nature of this game at all. So France winning that one both in the first and second half. So in the second game we had Italy against Namibia, and it was 17-8 in the first half and 35-0 in the second half. So Italy really kicked on in that game in the second half. Again, arguably that the bench had a big impact by coming on in the second half, and Namibia fading away in that particular game. Then we go to Ireland's demolition of Romania, 33-8 in the first half, 49-0 in the second half. So again, the Irish momentum continued in that second half when they started to make the changes from the bench. And I think this is a key element in this year's Rugby World Cup. Teams that are going to be able to not only maintain their presence in the second half, but able to kick on and score more points as Ireland did. And yes, they were up against Romania, but it just shows the continuity of this Irish team is very... So looking at the Australia and Georgia game, 21-3 in the first half to Australia, but it was 14-12 in the second half. So Georgia really coming back in the second half, of course scoring that try at the end of the game. But again, it shows that the Australian bench didn't kick on with this game after having a healthy lead at half time. So Georgia nearly winning the second half of that particular game. So England, Argentina, and we know the impact of Tom Curry's dismissal after the first 90 seconds, 12-3 to England at half time, but they did kick on and win the second half 15-7. So it just shows that even with 14 men, England were able to rotate their players sufficiently and had enough depth in their squad to kick on and win that game against Argentina, winning the second half by 15 points. Next one I found really interesting, Japan against Chile, 21-7 to Japan in the first half, 21-5 in the second half. So Japan maintaining their presence in that game when they emptied their bench in the second half. So yeah, pretty good outcome for Japan. Then one of the bigger games of the weekend between South Africa and Scotland. It was 6-3 to South Africa at half time. And I think what we saw in the second half of that game was South Africa's defense having a big impact, and also their bench rotation when they came on in the second half. And South Africa were able to win that second half by 12 points to 0. Now, an interesting fact may be from this weekend's game that Scotland, Romania and Namibia were the three teams that didn't score any points in the second half of their respective games. So I'm sure that Gregor Townsend and his squad would be very unhappy that they weren't able to score a point against South Africa in that second half. And obviously the bench that they brought on did not do the job against the Springboks. So something to look for from Scotland. Last game of the weekend, the blockbuster from Bordeaux, 18-14 to Wales in the first half, and then 14-12 in the second half. So as the overall final score would indicate, this game was very tight, and as we saw the game, it was seesawing a bit between the first and the second half. So there we go, there's a couple of deep dives into both discipline and the impact of the bench from the first weekend of this Rugby World Cup. And yeah, I thought it was pretty interesting to look at those stats and just to see how things played out. Remembering, any team that was in the lead at half time in this first weekend's games went on to win their game in this weekend's competition. Now, a couple of teams I want to talk about in terms of how they impressed me over the weekend, and I've just categorized this in a couple of different areas. The first one is those teams that probably impressed me the most. And I've got two teams in this area. One is South Africa, the other is Ireland, and for different reasons. So first of all, I think South Africa did very well against a very good Scottish team, and I've read a lot of the comments on my review of that game, and I think some of the points that people are missing out is, or the main point that people are missing out is, this is a very good Scotland rugby team, and I think South Africa played this game very smart. They waited for the opportunities, they used their defensive patterns very well to get up into the face of the Scottish team. And I think any team on this given day against the Springboks team would have found it very hard to get through that defence. When they had the opportunities, they created something out of it, a little bit of magic from Manie Libbok, and off they went and they scored the points they needed to win that game. So I was impressed by South Africa this weekend because of the strength of the Scottish team. And I think they played really, really well. And they've got players, they've got the depth, as I just showed in my analysis of the two halves. South Africa were able to kick on and win that second half and keep Scotland to 0 points, and I think that was quite significant in this particular game. The second team that really impressed me from this first weekend was Ireland, and I'll tell you why. Because even though they were up against Romania, and a lot of people will say, yeah, but Romania is no competition, I think the poll on my community page, and if you haven't been participating in my polls on the community tab of this YouTube channel, get over there now and throw down your comments and your vote. But on that community page, I think 90% of you said that Ireland were going to win this game, and that maybe there would have been more people thinking Ireland were going to win this game. But what I saw from Ireland this weekend was, not only did they go out there and do the job that had to be done against Romania, but they showed with their depth of squad. They went out there with their close to A team and they played very, very good rugby. They controlled the game after that first 10 or so minutes where they seemed to be a little bit rusty, and then they clicked into gear and they went away and scored 12 tries. And the nature of the tries, the way they kept control of the ball, was very, very impressive. And also with their reserves coming on as well. I think the substitutions were really good. Bundyaki had a huge game, of course, and I could have gone through a list of other Irish players that played very, very well in that game. So even though it was against one of the smaller rugby playing nations in this year's Rugby World Cup, I think Ireland did what they had to do. They looked very, very good in doing it, and more importantly, they came away without any major injuries to key players from that game. So after the two teams that impressed me the most, we've got a group of countries that played very well in the weekend. Were probably the next level down, and they included France, England, Australia, Wales, Fiji and Scotland. So going through that list, France, I think, handled the pressure of the opening game very well against the All Blacks. They put the All Blacks under pressure, they put points on the scoreboard, and they handled that game with a great amount of discipline. So I think France did very, very well in their opening game. And then England, I think they played very well with 14 men. They did what they had to do to win. I called it winning ugly. A lot of people got on my back about it, but I will concede the fact that England played a fantastic game for the conditions they were under with 14 men. And George Ford, of course, was the standout in that game. We're yet to see, though, whether England can continue this form as they head through the Rugby World Cup. Next up, I thought Australia, they had a good first half against Georgia. They didn't kick on with it too much in the second half, but they got a much needed win that they needed in this group, Pool C, which is going to be a very difficult group, of course. And I can't wait to see that Australia versus Fiji game coming up this week. I think that's going to be extremely telling in Pool C of this year's Rugby World Cup. Then we have Wales, Fiji and Scotland. Wales, of course, had that great game against Fiji. They showed enough in the first half that they're going to be a threat in this year's Rugby World Cup. They're going to have to tighten things up. The defence was a bit sloppy when Fiji got on a roll, and Dan Beggar is very important to their outcome, I think, in this year's Rugby World Cup, with his kicking percentages going to be very important for Wales. Scotland, that loss against South Africa is going to hurt because they weren't able to play their game, and they're going to have to work out how to beat teams that have got these big defences. So I was impressed with Scotland in the first half. I didn't think we'd get to half-time at 6-3, so they exceeded my expectations when it came to that, but they didn't score any points in the second half, and that was rather disappointing for Scotland. And then we have Fiji, of course, and what a game it was. They came up a little bit short, just the execution of a couple of plays, and also unfortunate with the yellow card and the timing of that yellow card in particular. I think it stopped their momentum a little bit. But looking at them going forward, as I said, that game against Australia this weekend is going to be a cracker. It's going to determine the success factor of Fiji in this year's Rugby World Cup. And I think they're going to put it all on the line against Australia. We're going to see another blockbuster game with the Flying Fijians this weekend. So they were on that list and that group of teams that showed a lot of good stuff in this year's Rugby World Cup. I enjoyed watching those games and looking forward to their next round next weekend. And then we have a group of teams that didn't impress me this first weekend, and they include New Zealand, Italy, Argentina and Japan. I thought the All Blacks looked clueless against France. They made too many mistakes, their discipline was off, and a lot of pundits on different YouTube channels, the All Blacks will be back, the All Blacks will bounce back, and all the rest of it. Jeff Wilson and all my friends down under in New Zealand talking about the hope of the All Blacks, the belief they have in the All Blacks. And listen, I'm a huge All Blacks fan, have been since the day I was born. But I see fundamental problems in this team. I don't think they've got the depth, and I don't think they've got the discipline to be able to go through and win this year's Rugby World Cup. But the biggest problem I see in this All Black team is that once they get under pressure, they start to capitulate, and we've seen that against the Springboks, and we saw it against France, giving away too many penalties, giving away the ball, and not being able to respond when they go down on the scoreboard. So let's see what happens going forward, but I think the All Blacks are in a lot of trouble. Okay, looking at Italy, and while they had a really big win in their first game against Namibia, I think that Namibia played very well, first of all, but I think Italy had some concerns in that game, and the concerns were they were making too many errors, and it wasn't really until the second half where they kicked away with it in that particular game. So Italy didn't play up to what expectation I had of them. I think they can improve, and I think that game against the All Blacks is going to be more interesting than what some people are thinking. I think if Italy can get a roll on and put a bit of pressure on the All Blacks, we might see a close game. Let me know what you think about that one. The other two teams that didn't really impress me in the weekend were both Japan and Argentina. Argentina, I was really disappointed in their play against England. England came in with the right game plan, and particularly when they went down to 14 men, they managed that game very, very well. And Argentina didn't have the answers for that game against England. And Japan, on the other hand, whilst they had a win and a healthy win, it's not the Japan of old, is it? It's not the Japan we're used to seeing. They've got a lot of imports in that team now, and they seem to be a little bit disjointed under Jamie Joseph coaching style. So hope I'm proven wrong. Hope Japan come back and show us a little bit more of the old cherry blossoms in this year's tournament. And then my final review of teams for this weekend are a group of teams that I've put together that I think will be better off because of the experience they've had in this year's Rugby World Cup. And those teams are Georgia, Romania, Chile and Namibia. And I think all of those teams will be looking at how they played in that first game, perhaps a little bit disappointed, but they'll come back stronger. And the key thing here is for these countries, it's all about growing the game of rugby and attracting more players into the game at different levels, men and women, young kids getting involved, but also coaches and people getting in with the right coaching skills to take these nations to the next level. So looking at Georgia, Namibia, Chile and Romania, I hope to see in 4 years' time that these teams have really kicked on, because I see a lot of potential there. I think Georgia could be a really good rugby team if they get some solid coaching in around their offensive play and get some key players other than Matt Kava that are able to open up that backline and score some points. They've also got to dominate in their forward position, and I think that's something that let them down a little bit against Australia. Chile, very exciting team. They did some great plays in their game against Japan, and again, for a nation that's come into the Rugby World Cup for the first time, hats off to you boys. You've done a fantastic job so far, and I for one are going to be watching the remainder of your games in this year's Rugby World Cup. And then Namibia and Romania. Well, Romania got thumped by Ireland, and I think there needs to be a little bit of soul searching going away. I think Romania are better than this, but they didn't show it. And again, they've got a lot of imports in that team, so I think it's going to be a case of working out the style that Romania want to play get a lot better in defence, and then seeing what they can do in international rugby as they go forward. And then the last team in that group, Namibia, they continue to be in the World Cup, which is good for the world of rugby. They need to continue to learn. They've got a ex-South African coach in there at the moment, so I hope to see a lot more for them in the future. So there you go, there's my review of the first weekend of this year's Rugby World Cup, looking at some of the teams that impressed me, taking a deep dive into their discipline and the impact that these teams had off the bench. Probably the player of the weekend for me this weekend was George Ford. I think he managed that game really well for England. High percentage of kicking, and of course the innovation using the drop kick to their advantage. I think that was probably the standout, but there were a lot of good players across the weekend, and I'll make another video about that at a later stage. So there we go. Now we get excited about week 2 of this year's Rugby World Cup. We've got France up against Uruguay, New Zealand against Namibia coming up Thursday and Friday. So they're going to be exciting games to see how the changes are made in those two leading teams and what impact they have on the outcome of those games. Now don't forget to drop me your comments about all the things I've talked about in this video. Agree with me, disagree with me, but be respectful, and yeah, continue to enjoy this amazing World Cup. I'll be back again soon as we head into the next weekend's round of rugby at this year's Rugby World Cup. Until then, everybody, stay safe, stay well, and keep enjoying your rugby. Bye for now.